Good morning and welcome to another online Sunday school class with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. As always, we like to begin by reminding you that we here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church believe that Jesus is the Christ, that he's the Son of the living God who lived a perfect life and died a sacrificial death for your sins and for mine, and that if you will place your hope and trust in Jesus Christ as both Lord and Savior, that you will be saved. If you would like more information about what it means to make Jesus Christ your Lord and Savior, we would invite you to follow the link in the description that will take you to a full gospel presentation, as well as how to respond to the gospel and how to connect with Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. If you live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we would invite you to join us for worship at 11 o'clock on Sunday mornings. If you do not live in the Hardin County, Kentucky area, we would still like to connect with you and help you find a Bible-believing church where you do live. As we continue on in our study of the Gospel of John, we're going to be in session 3 today, which is titled, I Will Raise. And we're going to be looking at John chapter 2, specifically verses 11 through 23. So again, this is session 3, titled, I Will Raise, looking at John chapter 2, verses 11 through 23. And I want to begin with a question, as we always do. And as we ask questions, we want to encourage you to pause the video and write some things down, or have a discussion if you're watching this with other people in order to get an opportunity to interact with it. But to ask this question, I want you to first think about signs that you might see driving along the road. Maybe there is a particular sign that really comes out, like one of those really unique type of signs. Maybe it's somewhere you've been and they like claim to have an alien or something like that. I've taught or kind of preached a sermon, and in that sermon many years ago, I talked about a kind of a truck stop type of store place that I've been to in southern Missouri called Boomland, and you just see billboard after billboard letting you know that Boomland is coming up, and Boomland has homemade fudge, and Boomland has a huge selection of hot sauces and all sorts of stuff, and then it's like exit now for Boomland, and when you exit, it really is this it's a gas station, it's like a truck stop, and then it just has a restaurant and all sorts of other things in it, and it's kind of a big tourist, I don't want to say tourist trap, but a big kind of tourist stop if you're driving through southern Missouri. And I want you to kind of keep that in mind. Think about that for just a second, or think about, put in your head, what kind of signs do you see on the road that you really notice and care about? And with that, I want to ask this question: what signs stand out to you when driving on the highway, and how do these signs help you make decisions along the way? So you kind of already have that sign in mind, and you can go ahead and write that down or kind of discuss that. But then how do signs in general, that sign in particular, or just signs in general, help you make decisions as you are driving down the highway? Pause the video, take a couple minutes. We would encourage you to either write some things down with pen and paper, or discuss this if you're there with your spouse, and then we'll keep going in our study. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, well, hopefully you've had a good discussion about that or written some things down. I am a parent and a father of 3 kids, and so when I am on the road, there are some things that are always important to be aware of. And one of the biggest things in my family is the I have to go to the bathroom. And so if there is one sign that I like to see, it's rest area ahead. And so when I think about it, my wife and I pretty much have a good working knowledge of where the rest areas are between Elizabethtown, Kentucky and Columbia, Missouri, because that's one of the places we travel a lot. And we will plan stops and opportunities to not only go to the bathroom, but get our dog out and let him go to the bathroom and all those things around rest areas. And those signs really do help us plan our trip. And so if we have a kid that suddenly says, hey, it's not an emergency yet, but I need to go to the bathroom, we kind of know, and we see the signs that say, okay, the next rest area is this far away. And so we'll say, okay, can you make it this many minutes? And usually they say yes, and that's what we do. And so that's a way that these signs help us make decisions. Obviously, when we are stopping for a meal, if we have to at some point, it's not uncommon for us to pull into a town, or as we're going through and you start to notice the exits, we'll have those restaurants or those things there, and we'll say, okay, they've, especially if I don't care what we eat, say, okay, I see an Arby's and a Wendy's and a Taco Bell and a McDonald's. What do you guys want to eat? And we'll have those discussions and make those decisions. The book goes on to say this: Signs point beyond themselves. If you think about it, and what it's saying there is that, the sign is not saying, hey, there's a McDonald's right here, but there's a McDonald's at this exit. And if you take this exit, then you'll be able to get to a McDonald's relatively quickly. Signs point beyond themselves. John's gospel is full of signs that point to Jesus. He included these signs so people would recognize Jesus as the Messiah and believe in him. As we study today's verses, think about signs that have pointed you to Jesus in life. As we work our way through John chapter 2, verses 11 through 23, pay attention to how Jesus' words and actions point to the truths about who he is, his crucifixion, his resurrection, and his kingdom. John started this account with a story that's familiar to a lot of us, but had a big impact for those around Jesus. So our passage really begins at the very end of our kind of the first section of chapter 2. And prior to that, what we see is kind of that very famous story about Jesus turning water into wine. And one of the interesting things about that miracle is in the Gospel of John, it's kind of considered the first big sign or evidence that Jesus was the Messiah. And it's one that most people know, and you see it joked about even in movies and whatnot, but not too often do people really sit down to read it. And I would even encourage you, if you want to, you could pause the video right now and go back and read the first part of John chapter 2, because it's interesting to read, because so often we don't really know what happened. And basically Jesus, he's at a point where he has some followers, he has some disciples, and he goes to a wedding with his mother and his brothers in Cana, which is a kind of a neighboring town, an area in the Galilee region. And while they're there, the wedding, there's a big feast, there's a big kind of meal party thing, and they run out of wine. And so that would have been a major faux pas, for lack of better words. If there's out of wine, that means they're out of drinks entirely. They don't even, it's not like they can even go just get water. They could, but they'd have to, it's just not what they would do. And so this is kind of the threat of the party being over, and it would have been very much so an embarrassment. And for some reason, this information gets relayed over to Mary, and Mary goes to Jesus and says, Jesus, they're out of wine. And I love Jesus' response there, because he's like, what's that got to do with me? Like, it's not my time. It's not time to reveal myself yet. What does this have to do with me? And she just basically, and I love it, and we may not get the full dialogue, but basically, he tells Mary, tells his mother, what is this to me? And she just turns to the waiters and says, just do whatever he says. And I can just picture her saying that and walking away, and Jesus being like, okay. And there is some jars there that are made for water. And what's interesting about those jars is they're made for that ceremonial washing. Like, they are there, you fill them with water. It was customary for Jewish people before they ate, before they did that, to go through kind of a washing process, a washing ritual, in order to then be kind of ceremonial clean enough to go in and eat a meal. And that's what those jars were for. Now, it kind of says that they were empty. They may not have been completely empty. They may have just been not as full as they were, because people had gone through and done the ceremonial washing. And so he says, go and fill them up, or fill them back up, and does so, and then basically tells them, dip some of the water out and take it to the head waiter. And when they do so, the head waiter takes a drink, and the water has been turned to wine. And he ends up going to the groom and saying, most people put out their best stuff first, and then as the day goes on and people's taste buds kind of begin to be altered by the alcohol, they bring out the cheaper stuff because they don't really know the difference. He goes, but you've brought out your best stuff later. Like, this stuff is fantastic. I'm very impressed by what you're giving out. And while pretty much no one else in the party knew what Jesus had done, there were some people who did know, and that included Mary, undoubtedly Jesus' brothers as well, and maybe sisters if they're not mentioned, as well as those that were following Jesus. And that's really where we pick up in our story. And we're going to start in verse 11 and read just verses 11 and 12. And I want you kind of to listen for the reason that Jesus went ahead and performed this miracle. So starting in verse 11, we read this. Jesus did this, which was the turning water to wine, the first of his signs in Cana of Galilee. He revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. After this, he went down to Capernaum together with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and they stayed there for only a few days. So as we look at this and kind of they give us some purpose behind that, that's one of the things that John really does, and he's not bashful about it at all, is he really makes it a clear throughout the book of John why he's telling us this and why he's writing this. And so in this particular passage, he's telling them that Jesus did this, and he revealed his glory, he kind of revealed who he was, and because of it, his disciples believed in him. Now, a little bit of understanding and context here. It's not that they didn't believe in him and now they did, but it was something that began to deepen or further their belief or their trust in him. And so what happened is Jesus performed this miracle, and his followers began to realize this man is more than just a teacher, more than just a rabbi, more than just someone that is going to teach us how to be really good God followers, God-fearers, and we can start teaching other people how to do those things. That this man is something more than that he's something greater. So it's not that they didn't believe in Jesus, they didn't trust him, and now they do, but more accurately, it's that they were coming into a deeper understanding of who Jesus was. This leads us to a question the book asks is, how did the people respond to this sign? Now, we've kind of answered that already, but I want you to kind of look at the text and really pull out what John is trying to communicate here. So just take a couple minutes and answer that question, and then we'll keep going in our study. All right, so if we look at the text again, just to verse 11, it says, Jesus did this, the first of his signs in Galilee of Cana. He revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. So you probably said something along those lines. Now, one of the things that the book points out is the word to believe, the verb to believe, is the same word that where we get faith from. It's this pisteuo or pistis. There's a Greek word there. And because of that, there's an acknowledgement here that these words are interchangeable, that when we talk about that they had their faith was deepened, that their belief in him, that their understanding, like all of those things are encompassing here. And it's really kind of a very neat thing to realize that this is something that was drawing them into a deeper faith with them. From here, we see that Jesus and his brothers and mother and them went, I believe it says they went down, which is kind of an idea that they went downhill. It was kind of an altitude thing, into Capernaum, but they really didn't stay there very long. And then we're going to begin to see where Jesus' story goes from here. And we're going to pick up in verse 13 and read through verse 17. And as we do so, I want you to consider what caused Jesus' reaction to what he saw taking place in the temple. So that gives us an indication of where he is. Picking up in verse 13, reading on to verse 17, we read this. The Jewish Passover was near, and so Jesus went up to Jerusalem. In the temple, he found people selling oxen and sheep, doves, and he also found the money changers sitting there. After making a whip out of cords, he drove everyone out of the temple with their sheep and oxen. He also poured out the money changers' coins and overturned the tables. He told those who were selling doves, "Get these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." And his disciples remembered that it was written, "Zeal for your house will consume me." All right, so we've been asked to kind of consider what Jesus' reaction is. And I want you to kind of think about this as kind of this is transpiring. Jesus is going into the temple complex, and in the temple complex, there's kind of different stages. And so there's kind of the outer place where you're kind of going to walk into a wall, through a gate or, past a wall until where you're entering the temple complex. And once you get into that point, you're going to have both Jews and Gentiles. There's going to be some Gentile God-fearers. You're going to have some people, there's stuff going on there. I think during this, there's even called the Gentile court. You'll hear teaching going on out in there and people instructing and some of these rabbis doing their thing. There's a few other things. There's an opportunity to kind of wash and purify to go into a deeper place. And eventually you're going to get to a place where only priests can go, and then to a place where only the high priest can go, and then into the Holy of Holies. All of that is there. And one would expect, as you were walking into the temple complex, that as you walked in, you would see some sort of movements and acts of worship, and whether they were waiting to offer sacrifices or they were learning and all that stuff, you would kind of get this feel that you were in a place where God was present and everyone was there for the purpose of giving worship to God and glory and honor to God. And yet that's not what happens. Instead, Jesus walks into the temple complex, and the temple complex resembles more of a marketplace than it does a place of worship and a place of prayer. There are people selling animals, from doves all the way up to oxen, all that stuff. Now, there's a reason for this, that if they were expected to offer a sacrifice, it would have been probably very hard for, say, someone from Galilee to bring a lamb or especially bring an ox, a whole cow all the way with them on the journey. And then there's a lot of things that could happen, so tons of things that could go bad. And so it was not uncommon for, instead of them bringing one of their own animals from their own village or from their own livestock, it would be much more common for them to travel, and then once they enter Jerusalem, to then buy one. And over the probably the reality of this in the course of the years, not only did that become the norm, but then there became opportunities to buy, even entering all the way into the temple. And then you see this thing about money changers, and what kind of happened with that is the temple basically kind of created their own currency. And so not only were you in there to buy an animal for sacrifice, but you would have to take whatever money you had, which was probably Roman money, and or other things, and trade it in for temple money, so that then you could go buy temple things. And so there was a conversion rate there. There's probably a fee. And so what they probably ended up seeing is he's walking in. There are people taking advantage of the poor and those who would say had traveled from Galilee. There are people calling out, trying to get their animals, their turtle doves, their ox, their sheep to be the ones you sell. And there's all this going on. And for a lack of better words, it resembled more of a marketplace, and everyone being, very unscrupulous in the way that they handled it, and just knowing and imagine accepting the full reality that when you go to the Passover, when you go to this point, that when that day comes, that you are probably going to get fleeced. You're probably going to overpay for things because you don't really have another option. It's kind of like, for a lack of better words, and maybe this is a bad example, it's kind of like when you go to a place like Disney World or any sort of theme park, or even maybe the fair, and you just know you're going to overpay. When you go to the movie theater, you know that what might be $1 soda at McDonald's or the gas station is going to be a $5 soda. That's kind of the idea. They just knew that things are going to cost more, and they had to bring more in order to do what was probably a lot cheaper back home, but it was what was expected. This did not set well with Jesus. Imagine this is a place that you as God in the flesh have come into the place where people should be worshiping you, and instead of worshiping you, they're kind of worshiping commerce or capitalism or money instead of you, and that's not the place for it. And so when you think about how he responds really quite violently, and it says that he kind of braided together, he put together a whip very quickly, and then he began to drive out all of the animals and toss over the coins of the money changers. I don't know if that meant all the money, kind of in a like Robin Hood, throw out all of it and let the people get it, or if he just tossed over their personal stuff, the temple coins or whatever, in order to kind of create havoc and all that type of stuff. But he basically clears the temple of all of the commerce, and then he gives his reason. I want to kind of put that question back on you as an opportunity to pause the video and have some interaction with this question. What reason did Jesus give for his actions, and how do verses 13 and 15 support his assessment of the situation? Take a couple minutes to discuss that, and then we'll keep going in our study. So let's look at that. Let's look at verses 13 through 15 and kind of what he says here. So in verse 16, he says, "Get these things out of here. Stop turning my Father's house into a marketplace." And so kind of his reason for doing it is this is not a place of worship anymore. You've turned God's place of worship, and in the Synoptics it says that my house will be called a house of prayer, but you've turned it into a den of robbers. And he's saying that you've missed the point of what you're here to do, and you guys are taking away from the worship of God. And so he clears them out so that people, I really think his intention was so that people would be able to worship correctly, if that makes sense. People were able to worship correctly. And so he does that. And when you look at verses 13 through 15, you see that people were selling ox, sheep, doves. They were the money changers. Even with all that he did, his point was to clear out those places and to make room for it. And just the reality is they were showing a disregard for the worship of God and focused more on their opportunity to make money off of the situation. Being honest, if we could just critique for just a second, we see that with Christmas today, and not so much in the church. I don't think we do that in the church, but the world has really taken hold of the Christmas season and the Christmas holiday in order to make money off of it. And unfortunately, I think a lot of us still buy into it. And even though when we maybe walk into the church building, it's all about Jesus and his birth and the message of salvation that we get from the angels, but everywhere else, we are stressed out and overwhelmed because of baking and decorating and things that we want to do, parties and present buying and gift wrapping and all that type of stuff. And we kind of forget that we celebrate Christmas not so that we can exchange gifts and have parties and decorate our house, but we celebrate Christmas because Christ came to save us from our sins. And we get lost in all of that, and we get a disregard. But I want to put that back on you. What are some ways that people show disregard for worship today? And that can mean maybe specifically what we do on Sundays, on the Lord's Day. How do we show disregard for worship there? Or maybe just in the world as a whole. How do you see people show disregard for worship today? Take a couple minutes, write some things down, discuss it, and then we'll keep going in our study. So when I think about this, it's hard not to kind of have a chip on my shoulder as the guy who's usually up front doing the preaching. And I'll just kind of even point maybe to my own thing. And I tell people all the time, being a pastor ruins you sometimes for being just a member of the congregation. I've heard stories of pastors who kind of stepped away from pastoring and then became part of a congregation, and it was very hard on them. And maybe even hard on the pastor that was trying to shepherd them. But I've also had wonderful experience with pastors who have been a part of our congregation or other congregations that weren't that way at all. They were ready for that season of their life. But a lot of times when I am at a church and I'm listening to a pastor preach or a church sing, it's hard for me to not kind of put on my judgment hat and play the comparison game. And is okay, well, how do they do this and how do we do this, and which one do I think is more biblical, and what did he say and what did he not say, and how did he say it, and did I like it, or would I have worded it that way, or would I have used that translation? And I just being myself, I show disregard for worship because I'm not worshiping. I'm doing a job assessment. I'm doing a peer review. I'm being judgmental of this other church instead of just enjoying the moment and worshiping with them when I'm not in charge. Other things we see happen that show disregard for worship today is kind of the same thing, only with music. We are too busy judging the music. I like this, I don't like this. They were a good singer, he was a good singer, she was not a good singer, all that type of stuff. We take notes, we don't take notes, we don't participate, we're writing grocery lists, we're passing notes, we're looking at our phone. There's all things that we can do. We bring distractions into the building, and all of these things show disregard for worship. And then a lot of times just the simple thing of not showing up. We show disregard for the worship of God when we don't show up to worship. More often than not, we're not nearly as focused on worship outside of God's house than we are when we are in God's house. And a lot of people don't really probably acknowledge that fault that's going on there. The book goes on to say, everything Jesus did and said pointed to his role as Messiah. And while he would put an end to the sacrificial system through his death and resurrection, he still wanted to make sure people had an opportunity to focus on God and worship him. But that wasn't an acceptable motive for everyone. Let's look at verses 18 through 23, wrapping up our time. And I want us to draw attention to how different people responded to Jesus and his actions. So we're going to notice the responses of people. All right, picking up in verse 18, reading through to verse 23, we see this. So the Jews replied to him, "What signs will you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered, saying, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it up in 3 days." Therefore the Jews said, This temple took 46 years to build. Will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. So when he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered what he had said, that he had said this, and believed the scriptures and the statements Jesus has made. While he was in Jerusalem during the Passover, the festival, many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. So I think we have 3 groups here and see how they respond. So one, we have the generic term, the Jews. And what's probably being meant there was kind of the established leaders. This could have meant Pharisees and Sadducees and priests and scribes. It could have also just meant some people that were very much so involved in the tradition and people maybe from Jerusalem and even Galilee that were just very invested in what was doing now. And their immediate response was, what can you show us? What credentials can you show us to make us believe that you actually have the authority to do what you just did? That all this clearing of the temple that you just did, that you actually have authority to do that. So they immediately come with, I want proof, that kind of old Missouri thing. You need to show me that you have a right to do this. It probably had less to do with performing a miracle that like we are going to see and that we certainly see in the other Gospels, but a lot more to do with just by what right, like who gave you the right to do this? And he responds in a thing that he kind of knows they're not going to do, destroy this temple that's taken 46 years to build and I'll raise it up in 3 days. And he never meant the actual temple, but he intended for them to think. And he's like, listen, if you really want a sign, you can do this. And knowing full well they're not going to do it, nor would they even understand what he was saying. So that's group one. Group one, odds are they're not going to believe. Nothing he's going to say is going to convince them. And even if he did do something miraculous, they probably would have said he had a demon and accused him in that regard. Does that make sense? So then the second group is the disciples. And the disciples in the moment, notice that in the moment, they don't know what's going on. They don't get it. They see him do it. They know about the water to wine, which was probably a big deal for them. They were probably expecting not this when he got to Jerusalem. They see him do it. They're like, I don't understand what he's doing, but I know he's done these things in the past. And so I'm going to keep trusting him. And maybe one day I will understand. Well, that's a good mindset. That's really something we as Christians, especially today, should be following. Listen, when we think about our walk with Jesus and we think about how we mature and we grow in our faith in Jesus, that's kind of the mindset we should have. Like, okay, I'm going through a season that is very difficult for me right now. But I know that God was there for me when I gave my life to Jesus. I know that God was there for me when I went through hardships in the past. I know that God has been there for me when I was, when I was at camp or this event or that event. I know God was there. And since I know he was there then, I'm going to keep trusting him now, even when I don't understand what's going on. And I'm going to trust that in the future, I will begin to understand what's going on. That's a great mentality. And I love that about the disciples, that they don't understand, but then after the resurrection, after all things have been completed, all things have been fulfilled, they could go back and go, oh, wait a minute. I didn't understand what he was doing and what he was saying back then. Now I do. Now I understand why I needed to trust him and I needed to follow him, and that what he did was right and good and true. And he actually did it. Makes a lot of sense. The last group is we have those kind of individuals. So you have the Jewish kind of leadership or the Jews as a whole. But then they said that many believed in his name when they saw the signs that he was doing. The last group is a group of people that were coming into that place. See, the disciples in the original, maybe Mary, maybe his brothers and the disciples, they had already seen Jesus perform signs and wonders, and they began to believe. But now other people were. So even though the Jews wanted a sign, but Jesus knew that even if they got one, they wouldn't believe. But other people came to Jesus with an open heart and a willingness to place their faith in him. And they did experience, as Jesus said earlier in the passage, remember what he said in verse 11, that he revealed his glory and the disciples believed. I really believe that's what we see even happening in here. When it says that they believed because of his signs and wonders, he revealed his glory and they believed. And so we see those who who didn't believe and weren't going to, those who did believe, and even though they didn't understand everything, they saw their faith grow deeper, and also those who didn't believe but experienced the glory of God and came to belief and came to saving faith in Jesus Christ. It's really quite remarkable how we see all of these different people interacting with Jesus and coming to either accept or reject who he was as the Messiah because of what he did. This leads to a question for us, which is, what is the significance of Jesus pointing to the temple as a metaphor of his resurrected body? Take a couple minutes and think about that. He makes this example and he says, tear this building down. He says, tear down the temple and I'll rebuild it in 3 days. But he means it as a metaphor. What's significant about that? Why does that matter, especially at this place in the story? Take a couple minutes and discuss that, and then we will begin to wrap up our study. All right, I want to read to you what the book says about this. It says that he was highlighting the insufficiency of the sacrificial system and the completeness of his whole work. But as usual, most of the crowds missed his point. And I have to be honest with you, I kind of missed that in the midst of all that too. He's pointing out the fact that I think it's important to look at this and realize that, one, he's kind of pointing out the fact that it's really not the temple or temple worship that's going to save you. It's faith. It's faith in Jesus and really faith in God that he is providing the sacrifice, the atoning sacrifice, that he's going to actually set things right. And Jesus is pointing out like, hey, I'm that. I am the fulfillment of the temple. I am the fulfillment of temple worship, that I am going to be the sacrifice that every sacrifice up to this point is pointing towards. And when I lay down my life and when I'm sacrificed and when I raise from the grave 3 days later, which is what he's talking about in this passage, that then everything will be perfectly atoned for and never have to worry about sin and the effects of sin on the person again if they've placed their hope and faith in Jesus Christ. I have to add to it that one of the things I find interesting about this is the way John presents it is that Jesus makes it abundantly clear from the very beginning, chapter 2 of this gospel, that he has come to die on the cross and rise from the grave, to be killed and raised from the grave 3 days later. There is much debate on if you look at the synoptics, the cleansing of the temple all seem to appear in the Passover season right before the crucifixion, and yet John presents it a lot earlier. You'll see kind of even in our passage or in your book, if you've got one, that they kind of say that well, John was not as concerned about it being chronologically accurate like Luke was, or may have been more interested in, but was just putting things in the right context. I tend to be inclined to believe that, we're actually dealing with two separate events, that he did the same thing twice, just because some of the words are different. This is my Father's house and you've turned it into a marketplace. My father said that his house should be a house of prayer, and you've made it a den of robbers. I think that now he could have said both. It could have been one event. I tend to view this as two different events, maybe several years apart, in the idea that Jesus did do it once and then come back probably at the Passover and do it again. Was really no way of knowing, but we do know that he did this and he did that, and whether it was the same event or two separate events, we don't really know. That's not how they recorded things back then, so there's no way for us to kind of know that today. Going on, the book says this. It says, the crowds demanded some kind of external authority, but Jesus merely pointed to himself and his relationship with the Father. This is a question to close out our time together, is how does the resurrection serve as a sign of Jesus' glory and authority? And that's really a question I wanted to kind of close our time with, is how does the resurrection, which he clearly is referencing here, really point to Jesus' glory and his authority, as that's what's being kind of talked about in this passage. And what does that mean for us today? When we look at why is the resurrection so important, or is the resurrection so important as it relates to Jesus' glory and his authority, even in our lives today? So take a couple minutes, discuss that. I would encourage you to close your time in prayer and then join us for worship Sunday morning, 11 o'clock, right here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. You can join us online through Facebook Live. You can also watch us in person right here at Tunnel Hill Baptist Church. Thank you so much for joining us. We'll see you soon. God bless.